My, fa my father-in-law raised his glass at Thanksgiving and told the entire table I'd never worked a real day in my life. 6 days later, I found the folder that proved I'd been paying his son's mortgage for 3 straight years, and Robert had let every person in that room believe otherwise. My name is Patricia Hale. I'm 41, married to Robert for 16 years, and for the last 6 of them I've run a small handmade leather goods business out of our garage, Wildflower and Company. Everyone in Robert's family calls it Patricia's little hobby, said the exact same way you'd say Patricia's little cough. That Thanksgiving, Walter Hale stood at the head of the table, wine glass raised. To Robert, he announced, the man keeping this whole family afloat while the rest of us just try to keep up. Laughter. Warm nods. My mother-in-law, Margaret, patted my hand like I was a child who'd colored nicely outside the lines. And Patricia's little shop, so adorable, keeping you busy. I forced a smile I'd perfected over 16 years of exactly this moment, over and over, at every holiday, every birthday, every ordinary Sunday dinner. Robert didn't correct him. He laughed along, refilled his own glass, let the moment pass exactly the way he always let it pass. Later, washing dishes alone, I heard his voice low in the hallway, phone pressed to his ear. I wasn't trying to listen, but I heard enough. Just wait until after the holidays. I don't want to deal with the emotional mess right now, not with everyone here. I stood frozen at the sink, water running over a plate I'd already rinsed twice. Emotional mess. What emotional mess? I had no idea, drying my hands on that dish towel, that I was about to discover exactly what kind of mess my husband had spent years quietly preparing for, and that none of it had anything to do with the business his family loved to laugh about. I told myself it was nothing. A work call, maybe, some deadline he didn't want to explain over turkey. But the phrase kept circling back all night. Emotional mess, like it had teeth. 6 days later, I was searching the office closet for tax documents for Wildflower's quarterly filing when I found a folder I didn't recognize, tucked behind old insurance paperwork. Robert's handwriting on the tab. Personal. Financial planning. I shouldn't have opened it. 16 years of marriage, and some quiet doubting part of me still felt guilty even reaching for it. Inside were printed mortgage statements, our mortgage, annotated in Robert's handwriting with a running tally I didn't understand at first. Dates. Amounts. And beside each one, a single word repeated over and over, covered. I sat down hard on the office floor and started actually reading. 3 years of mortgage payments, month by month, each one paid from an account I recognized instantly. My business account. Not our joint account. Mine. The one Robert had told me years ago made more sense to keep separate, so your hobby money doesn't get confusing to track. I'd been transferring a little extra toward the house every month for years, exactly the amount Robert suggested, exactly when he suggested it. I'd assumed it was on top of what he was contributing. There was no evidence anywhere in that folder of Robert contributing anything at all. My hands were shaking by the time I found the second document underneath it, a printed email, Robert's account, sent to someone named Priya Sharma, subject line, timeline discussion. I opened it before I could stop myself. Priya, appreciate you working through the numbers again. If we hold off until Q2 like you suggested, my equity position should be fully vested and I won't need to disclose the business assets during any settlement discussion. Patricia genuinely has no idea what I'm sitting on. Let's talk timing next week. I read it 4 times before the words fully landed. Robert wasn't just letting his family believe I contributed nothing. He'd been planning something with a lawyer or a financial advisor or someone that hinged specifically on me not knowing what he actually had. I searched Priya Sharma's name with trembling hands. Certified Divorce Financial Analyst. Her firm's website loaded a photo of a woman in a sharp blazer, smiling professionally, specializing in protecting high net worth spouses during separation. High net worth. Robert worked in mid-level logistics management. We lived comfortably, but nothing about our life had ever looked like high net worth to me. Unless he had something I'd never been told about. I closed the laptop, my chest tight with a feeling I couldn't fully name yet. Not quite betrayal, not quite fear, something colder and more clarifying than either. For 6 years, I'd absorbed every joke about my little hobby with a tired smile, quietly funneling thousands of dollars a month into a house Robert let his entire family believe he alone was providing. And now, apparently, he'd been sitting on equity substantial enough to need a specialist's help hiding it from me, while planning, on some quiet timeline only he knew, to leave. I didn't confront him that night. I needed to understand exactly what equity position meant before I let him know I'd seen it. I called my best friend Yasmin the next morning, a CPA who'd handled Wildflower's books since year one, and the only person I trusted enough to look at this clearly instead of emotionally. She read through photos of the folder twice before looking up. "Trish, this isn't just a savings account," he forgot to mention. Equity position language, a divorce financial analyst, a vesting timeline, that's the language people use around stock options or ownership stakes. Does Robert have any kind of equity anywhere? I thought hard. His company did some kind of employee ownership restructuring 2 years ago. He mentioned it once, in passing. Said it was complicated and not worth explaining. Yasmin's eyebrows rose. "I'd bet everything I own that not worth explaining is currently worth a great deal more than either of us assumes." We spent the next 2 hours doing what Robert apparently hadn't expected me capable of, actually digging. Public filings from his company's restructuring showed employee equity distributions tied to tenure and role. Robert had been there 11 years, senior enough that even a modest allocation, compounding since the restructuring, could plausibly be worth 6 figures. 6 figures, sitting quietly, unmentioned, while I redirected thousands from my own income every month to cover a mortgage he'd let his family believe he alone was carrying. "There's something else," Yasmin said quietly, sliding her own laptop toward me. I pulled Wildflower's full revenue history while we were at it, since we were already down this rabbit hole. "Trish, do you actually know what your business made last year?" I gave her the number I'd always given myself, casually, never digging deeper than a rough estimate. "Maybe 40,000? Something like that." She turned the screen around. The number on it wasn't 40,000. It was $211,000. I stared at the number until it stopped looking like a number and started looking like an accusation, not of me, but of every single assumption I'd let stand unchallenged for 6 years. "How is that even possible?" I finally managed. "I would have known if the business was doing that well." "Would you?" Yasmin asked gently. "You've never once looked at the full annual statements yourself, Trish." Robert set up the business account. Robert suggested the accountant originally, before you brought me on 2 years ago for the smaller stuff. Robert's the one who's always told you what to transfer and when. Something cold slid down my spine. "You think he's been managing what I saw?" "I think," Yasmin said carefully, "you should pull every original account statement, going back to year one, before you say another word to him." It took 3 days working with the bank to get full historical records released. What I found rearranged everything I thought I understood about my own marriage. Robert hadn't just failed to correct his family's jokes about my little hobby. He'd been the one, quietly, consistently, steering Wildflower's actual growth out of view, routing larger wholesale orders through a separate business line I'd never been shown, one that existed under a slightly different registered name, one he'd apparently set up for tax efficiency 3 years earlier and never fully explained. The wholesale account alone had processed nearly $90,000 I'd never once seen reflected in what I believed was our total revenue. My hands were steady now, in a way that surprised me. The shock had already burned through. What was left underneath it felt sharper, clearer, entirely new. Robert hadn't just been dismissive of my business. He'd been quietly, deliberately managing exactly how much of my own success I was ever allowed to see. I didn't say a word to Robert that week. Instead, I did something I should have done years earlier. I hired my own attorney, Renee Castillo, independent of anything Robert or his family had ever touched. Renee laid it out plainly during our first meeting. If what you're describing is accurate, espouse quietly restructuring business accounts to obscure your actual income, while separately concealing personal equity ahead of a planned separation, that's not just dishonest. Depending on how the wholesale entity was filed, it may cross into deliberate financial misrepresentation. What do I do? I asked. For now. Nothing visible, she said. Quietly document everything. Get your own accounts, your own copies of every filing. Do not let him know what you know until we're ready. Right now, he believes you're exactly where he's always kept you, unaware. That's the only advantage you currently have, and I don't want you to lose it. It was strange, sitting in that office, hearing someone finally validate an instinct I'd spent 16 years learning to quietly override. That weekend, Robert's family hosted another Sunday dinner. Walter made the same joke he always made, right on schedule. How's the little shop, Patricia? Sold any candles this week? I smiled the same practiced smile I'd worn for years. Actually, I said, it's been a really good quarter. That's sweet, Margaret said, already turning back to Robert. Robert, tell them about the promotion you're up for. I watched Robert accept the attention easily, effortlessly, the way he always did. A man everyone assumed was quietly carrying his family, standing in a room full of people who had no idea the numbers told an entirely different story. For the first time in years, I didn't feel humiliated sitting at that table. I felt like I was holding a hand no one else at the table knew I was playing. Renee's investigator, a quiet, methodical woman named Carol, took 11 days to compile what she called the full picture. I sat in Renee's office bracing myself for financial details. I wasn't braced for what came with them. 2 things, Renee said, sliding a folder across her desk. First, your husband has been viewing apartments. 2-bedroom units, always with the same person present. A coworker named Danielle Voss. Text records show consistent contact going back at least 8 months. The room tilted slightly, but strangely, less than I expected. Some part of me had already stopped being surprised by Robert. Second, Renee continued, and this is the part that actually changes our legal strategy, we pulled the full operating agreement for Wildflower and Company. I filed that myself, I said. Years ago, when Robert helped me set everything up. You filed the original paperwork, Renee said carefully. But 3 years ago, an amendment was submitted, listing Robert as a managing member with a 40% ownership stake, filed under a signature that appears to be yours. My mouth went dry. I never signed anything like that. I suspected as much, Renee said. We'll need a forensic handwriting analysis to confirm it, but if you're right, that's not just a business dispute anymore, Patricia. That's forgery. I sat there, absorbing it in pieces. The man who'd let his entire family mock my little hobby for 6 years had, at some point during those exact years, quietly forged my signature to claim nearly half of it as his own, not out of belief in what I'd built, but purely as leverage for whatever came next. Why now? I asked quietly. Why forge it 3 years ago, if he's only just planning to leave? Renee's expression was grim. Because 3 years ago is roughly when Wildflower's revenue started climbing sharply. I think your husband saw exactly what you were building, Patricia, long before anyone at that dinner table ever gave you credit for it. I went home that night and did something that would have terrified me a month earlier. I sat across from Robert at our own kitchen table and said absolutely nothing about what I knew. He, on the other hand, had plenty to say. "I've been thinking," he said, sliding a folder toward me 2 days later, his tone warm, reasonable, the exact voice he used when he wanted something without wanting to explain why. "With the business doing so well, we should formalize things properly. Protect it. I had our accountant draft something simple." I opened the folder slowly. Buried in careful legal language was a restructuring agreement, one that would have converted his forged 40% stake into something fully documented and irreversible, framed entirely as protecting Wildflower's future. "This looks thorough," I said carefully, giving nothing away. "Let me have my own accountant look it over before I sign anything this significant." Something flickered behind his eyes, the same flicker I'd seen over the birthday card months earlier, there and gone in an instant. "You don't need to overcomplicate this, Em. It's just paperwork." Em. He'd never once called me that. My mind snagged oddly on the small slip before the rest of it caught up. "I'll have it back to you by Friday," I said, folding the document closed. That night, I photographed every page and sent them straight to Renee. Her response came within the hour. "Do not sign this under any circumstances. This confirms exactly what we suspected. He's trying to formalize the forged stake before you have any reason to look closely." I sat alone in the dark kitchen where this had all started, months earlier, holding a stranger's birthday card. Robert was still upstairs, probably already certain this had gone exactly the way he'd planned. He had no idea I'd stopped playing the version of me he'd built his entire plan around. Christmas dinner was at the Hale family home this year. The same dining room, the same chair Walter always stood beside to make his toast. I'd asked Renee one question before I left the house that morning. "Is it time?" "You tell me," she'd said. "You're the one who's been carrying this quietly the longest." Walter rose right on schedule, glass in hand. "To Robert," he began, the exact same opening line he'd used every year I could remember. "The one holding this whole family together." "Actually," I said before he could continue, my voice steadier than I expected it to be, "I'd like to say something too, if that's all right." The table went quiet in the specific way rooms go quiet when someone breaks a script no one knew was a script. "For 6 years," I said, "this family has called Wildflower my little hobby. Last year, it made $211,000. I know that number precisely, because I finally started asking to see it myself instead of trusting someone else to tell me." Margaret's smile faltered. Robert's face had gone very still. "I also recently learned," I continued, "that 3 years ago, someone forged my signature on a document claiming 40% ownership of that business for himself. I'm having it professionally verified now, but I think everyone at this table can probably guess whose handwriting it likely traces back to." "Patricia," Robert started, low, urgent. "There's also an apartment," I said, my voice not wavering once, "that Robert's been looking at with a coworker named Danielle for the last 8 months. I imagine that was meant to stay separate from tonight too." Silence swallowed the entire table. Walter's raised glass hung frozen in the air, forgotten completely. "Anyway," I said quietly, into the wreckage of a joke that had run for 6 straight years, "Merry Christmas." The fallout didn't happen all at once, the way it might in a movie. It happened in careful, methodical pieces, the same way I'd learned to build my case in the first place. The forensic handwriting analysis confirmed what Renee had suspected. The signature on the amended operating agreement wasn't mine. Combined with the timeline evidence, it gave Renee everything she needed to have the forged ownership claim voided entirely, restoring Wildflower fully into my name alone. The divorce proceedings that followed were far less complicated than Robert's careful timeline had ever anticipated. With the forgery on record and full financial disclosure now unavoidable, Priya Sharma's original strategy, hiding his vested equity until after the emotional mess had settled, collapsed before it could even be attempted. His equity, once so carefully protected, became fully discoverable, fully divided, fully accounted for. Danielle, as it turned out, hadn't known Robert was still legally married when the apartment search began. She ended things within a week of finding out, according to Margaret, who called me twice that January, once to apologize, stiffly, for years of dismissive jokes she said she never fully considered the weight of, and once simply to ask how I was doing, without an agenda attached to the question for the first time in 16 years. Walter never called at all. Some things, apparently, take longer than a single winter to reconsider. I kept the house. I kept Wildflower, fully, cleanly, entirely mine. Yasmin came on as a full financial partner that spring, and together we hired our first 2 employees by summer, something I'd been quietly dreaming about for years, always talked myself out of as getting ahead of myself, for a business everyone insisted wasn't serious. It had always been serious. I just spent 6 years letting someone else decide otherwise. A year after that Christmas dinner, Wildflower and Company moved out of the garage entirely, into a small leased studio downtown with a hand-painted sign above the door, the first thing I'd ever put my own name on without anyone else's approval attached to it. Robert and I split custody of exactly nothing, since we'd never had children, which turned out to be its own strange, quiet mercy in the middle of everything else. What we did split, eventually, fairly, legally, was a life built on numbers he'd spent years hoping I'd never learn to read for myself. I think about that Thanksgiving toast sometimes, Walter's voice, warm and certain, praising a man for holding up a family he'd actually been quietly, deliberately underfunding in every version except the one he let everyone believe. I think about how easy it was, for 6 years, to accept a smaller story about myself simply because it was the one being told loudest, most often, by people who'd never once bothered to check the math. I don't perform the practiced smile anymore. Not for anyone. I don't need to. Yasmin says I run the studio like someone who's always known exactly what she's worth. The truth is simpler than that. I just finally stopped letting someone else do the counting for me. What I know now, that I wish I'd understood years earlier, is this. Being underestimated isn't a reflection of your actual worth. It's just other people's convenience, wearing the shape of an opinion, right up until the moment you finally open the books yourself. If you found out, after years of being quietly dismissed, that you'd actually been carrying more than anyone around that table ever gave you credit for, would you have said something the first time you noticed, or would you have waited, the way I did, until the truth couldn't be ignored anymore? If Patricia's story moved you, don't forget to subscribe for more emotional journeys like